orchids literally just as well even in these solid pots. But if you want to be a little more historically correct and if you want to grow them a little bit more interesting pot, you take a pot like that, you know, and plant 2 plants in it, plant 1 plant in here. But when you see pots like this with all the holes in the side, those are sort of copies or takeoffs on the original orchid pots that you know, the people used to grow things in. What else should I tell you about orchids? What questions do you have about it? Yes, sir.
What about the pots that are wood, lattice?
Okay, that's a good question. In tropical climates where they have higher humidity and where they are in a nursery where people can water all the time, you don't even have to have any medium at all around the roots of the plants. And they make teak wood baskets because teak is a wood that doesn't really rot away. It's kind of like the cypress, the old swamp cypress that we used to have in this country, used as lumber a lot. And they'll make these slatted baskets like you're describing. They stick the plant down in the middle and tie the plant to something on the basket, and then they just hang it out there, and every day somebody goes by with a hose and just sprays the whole thing down with water. And if you were to go, I've not been to Thailand, but seen pictures of huge nurseries in Thailand where they have tens of thousands of plants like that. Same thing is true of Singapore. You know, these relatively inexpensive spikes of orchids that you see, you know, sold in the florist shops and some of the places like Central Market, those mainly come out of Singapore. They're a cut flower crop, and they grow those things just in the wooden baskets with no medium whatsoever.
I lived in Thailand, and my landlady had hundreds of these orchids, and they were in these little lattice.
Right. Yeah. The problem is if you're going to grow them in a lattice basket like that with no potting medium, you're going to have to water them every day in this climate, sometimes twice a day, sometimes 3 times a day. Do you have that kind of time? I'm envious. Most of us grow them in these pots where we only have to water them, you know, maybe twice a week. The other thing too is the plants that have the pseudobulbs like this, like say in nature, they can come from a from a climate that has a dry season. Go off on vacation for 2 weeks and forget about them. As long as the greenhouse doesn't get too hot, they'll be fine when you get back. If you can find a neighbor to water them, that's all the better, but I find that most neighbors that promise to water your plants when you're out of town, they water them the day before you get back to be sure they'll be good and wet when you get back there. Orchids, you get away with that. Now the ones like these that have no pseudobulbs, don't have any water holding organs, they suffer if they don't get enough water, but they're really very forgiving. Yes, ma'am?
I have one of those. How do I fertilize that?
Constantly.
Oh.
Every time you water, put some of that natural solution so that it has to grow and give that plant a lot of light. Cymbidiums are tough to get to bloom again, but if you give them enough light and let them get chilled in the fall. Again, these things come from the Himalayas originally.
They can put them outside.
Yes, but they won't take a hard freeze.
Okay.
But grow them outside all summer, put them where they get at least half a day of sun, and let them have several nights down in the 30s before you bring them in. And that many times will initiate the bloom spikes.
So they can take our Texas summer?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
as long as they get adequate water. Yes, ma'am.
Can you mist an orchid like daily? Does that help it or not?
It may help you, kind of like talking to your plants. That may help you, but my experience is that if you mist orchids a lot, all you get is a lot of calcium on the leaves. If you're going to mist them, use deionized or distilled water, but they really don't need that. Some people, you know, think that they do that with the effect of raising the humidity around the plants, which is what the plants would like. But to effectively raise the humidity, you'd need to do it about 10 times an hour, every hour of the day. So you wouldn't be doing anything but misting your plants. If you have some of the orchids that are a little bit more delicate, that like higher humidity, and you want to grow them inside, take a pan, a cake pan or a cafeteria tray or something like that, fill it with gravel, and set the plants on top of the gravel. You don't want the plants sitting down in the water, but set them on top of the gravel and let water stand around the gravel. You just got this constant column of humidity coming up around them, and that's a great way to grow them. But today's plants, they're tough. You really don't usually have to worry about that.
Talk about the natural fertilizer and fertilizing issues and types.
Well, natural fertilizer for orchids is mainly bird droppings and animal droppings and things like that that collect around the roots, nutrients that are actually coated onto dust particles that blow in and collect. The natural fertilizers, the organic fertilizers, tend to be products that are ammoniacal in nature, related to ammonia. They have a positive charge to them. They're called cations, and so they bind to the potting media and things like that. They stay in place. Chemical fertilizers tend to be the opposite in charge. They're what we call anions, the sulfates, the nitrates, the phosphates, things like that. And they don't bind to anything. They tend to wash away a whole lot more quickly. Now, orchid growers for years have used chemical fertilizers and have greatly increased the pollution in rivers and places like that because of the runoff of these nitrates and phosphates primarily. The organic fertilizers are not nearly so polluting. It doesn't take nearly as much to feed your orchids well. But I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's one of the biggest differences. And I think organic fertilizers are much better for orchids, having grown them both ways, than the chemical fertilizers are.
What about worm castings, sprinkling on the top?
Worm castings would be very good in a terrestrial orchid like the Cymbidium or like the Paphiopedilum, but on your epiphytic types, you quickly would get them plugged up to the point that they'd be holding too much moisture and cause problems. Now, there are a lot of good things in worm castings. If you want to take advantage of those things, what you can do is, in effect, make a compost leachate, not a compost tea. But take your bucket, soak your worm castings in there for 24 hours, and then pour the liquid off of that. You get all the benefit of the worm castings without the problem of making your potting medium too heavy. Yes?
I have a couple of orchids that came in a plastic container inside of a clay pot. I've left it in the plastic. Would it make any difference if I take it out of the plastic and just put it in the clay?
Clay pots tend to dry out faster. If you're a person who waters too often, clay pots are better. If you're a person who does not water frequently enough, plastic pots are probably better. For a long time, there was this great myth put out by the clay pot makers that plants wouldn't grow in plastic pots. You had to grow them in clay pots. Today, probably 99% of the plants grown in this country are grown in plastic pots, and they seem to do just fine. So grow it either way.
They've done well, so I didn't know.
And that's the thing, too. You know, I had a good friend who once wrote an article about growing orchids, and he called it something like Forgetting to Read the Book. And his whole point was that orchids can't read. And you read this book and it tells you have to do exactly this to make your plants grow well. It's not necessarily true. If your plants are doing fine with what you're doing, don't change. My training was in research biology. I did a lot of electron microscopy work back when electron microscopes were brand new. And I go to the director of our EM lab and say, Vanita, I did this, this, and this. Is that right? And she'd say, well, did it work? I'd say, yes, it worked very well. And she said, well, that's not the way I would have done it, but it worked, so that's right. And, you know, again, there are just no real hard, fast rules. If you're growing your orchids well, don't change on the basis of what somebody else told you. And be very careful in reading books about growing orchids. Use them as a good basic reference. But I don't know of any books on growing orchids that are written in this area. The better ones for us are the ones that are written in Florida, but all the original orchid books were written in England. And anybody that thinks that gardening in Texas is the same as gardening in England has never been to England. And the same thing is true. Most of the orchid books were originally written for this, in this country, were either in the Northeast or like Becky Northen's out of Wyoming, and they simply don't apply to this area. So experiment, grow, talk to people that grow these things well. Truly, it's one of the fun things about growing orchids. Orchid growers are, a lot of them are real characters, but most of them are really friendly people. And literally, I could go almost anywhere in the world, find an orchid grower, and find a friend that, you know, would give you any help you need, and just be somebody interesting to visit with. In fact, years ago, I went to New Zealand to a